What is up, everyone? It is Dylan Lasagna here. Actually, future Dylan Lasagna here, because I want to quickly make a correction to my past self when I recorded episode 94 of the podcast, Very Cold Lasagna. And because, the unexpected happens, I try to make my episodes as close up to date as possible, especially when it comes to the NFL. But yeah, a couple of days after I recorded that episode, this trade goes down. Literally the day that the episode goes up, 30 minutes after, this trade goes down. When it comes to the Seattle Seahawks, they traded away Russell Wilson when they literally said they wouldn't, but they traded away Russell Wilson and a 4th-round pick to the Denver Broncos, which is pretty insane. And as you see on the screen, this is what they got in return. So As I mentioned in this recap, my past self will mention that if they trade away Russell Wilson, it's rebuild city, in the Emerald City, and it's clearly on. The rebuild is clearly on in Seattle. But anyway, Seattle, they got a nice haul in return, but what they're gonna do with it, it'll depend. Now they got to look for a quarterback. But for now, those are my quick thoughts on the trade that happened literally just recently. Obviously, I'm not gonna express those thoughts in my past self in this clip, but when we do the next episode, I will obviously talk about this trade and whatever potential news is left in the next episode. When we do part 3 of my NFL season recaps, we'll address those corrections at the beginning of that episode. But anyway, until then, keep that lasagna very cold and enjoy the clip. You look at the Seahawks 2021, they finished 7-10, but going into this season, they had high hopes. They had high hopes of going back into the playoffs with Russell Wilson and Pete Carroll, and they were thinking more than their yearly spot in either the wild card or the divisional. They wanted to go back to the NFC Championship game. But heading into the season, there were a lot of questions about whether Russell Wilson and Pete Carroll were going to be in Seattle past 2021. Because while Pete Carroll was a guy well liked in the organization, perhaps it could have been time for a change in Seattle. Because let's face it, Pete Carroll has been there for well over a decade, actually it has been a decade now. And yes, he got him a Super Bowl title, but let's remember, he was also the same coach that called a pass at the 1-yard line, just trying to make Russell Wilson hero ball when he literally had Marshawn Lynch, his beast mode running back, in his disposal, but yet they decided to throw it at the 1-yard line, and we all knew what happened from there in Super Bowl 49. And since then, the Seahawks haven't been back to at least the NFC Championship game since that point. Meanwhile, for Russell Wilson, there was a lot of speculation last offseason about his frustration with the front office's inability to surround him with talent and at least some form of help, especially on the offensive line. And that led to, all this speculation about Russell Wilson possibly wanting a trade out of Seattle, and then all these teams being linked to such trade, but it amounted to nothing. So you go into the season with Russell Wilson, Pete Carroll still there, but then beside that, they had to, at least put together a roster, put together a team together for 2021. The problem is they didn't have much resources to do so. They didn't have any money to spend. They also didn't have any draft capital for the NFL draft. So they mostly kept things in-house. They re-signed Carlos Dunlap, Chris Carson. One of their only free agent signings was Kerry Hyder Jr. from the 49ers last year. They also only had 3 draft picks to speak of, because mainly in part due to the Jamal Adams trade from 2 off seasons ago, and then Quandre Diggs, and they also traded for Gabe Jackson. So their only notable pick in the second round from the 2021 draft was Western Michigan receiver Dwayne Eskridge. And speaking of Jamal Adams, he also was holding out a training camp because he wanted a contract extension. He wanted a big fat contract. So the Seahawks finally gave that to him so he could be the highest paid safety in the NFL. Whether that will benefit him, that remains to be seen. So for Seattle, they had limited resources. They also had a somewhat unhappy Russell Wilson and, some uncertainty regarding Pete Carroll's future. But, the Seahawks organization believed that Russell Wilson, Pete Carroll, could cook them up another postseason berth. And early on, things seemed a little shaky for Seattle. They started 2-2. You have some wins against the Indianapolis Colts and the 49ers on the road. But in between all of that, those week 1 and 4 wins were 2 very bad losses by Seattle. You lose to the Tennessee Titans at home in your home opener, and in that home opener, you were up big against Tennessee. But then in the second half, everything unravels because of your defense and Russell Wilson not doing particularly well against Ryan Tannehill and the Titans. So then that game goes to overtime, and then they choke that game away. Then they go to Minnesota, and primarily the same thing, but then the Seahawks pretty much get shut out in the second half, and they get blown out. So 2-2, I mean, it's not like the most terrible start in the world, but deep in the trenches, yeah, when you look at those 2 losses, not particularly great. But still, a chance for Seattle to try to make things right, despite, inconsistent play from Russell Wilson and a very bad defense. But then the wheels really came off for Seattle in week 5, just literally days after they beat the 49ers when they hosted the Rams on a Thursday night. So during that game, Russell Wilson injured his finger. I forgot where it was, but I think when he made contact with Aaron Donald, I believe, in that game. But nonetheless, he suffered a finger injury. He had to leave the game. He tried to get back in the game with various methods, but he had to sit out the game. In came Geno Smith, tried to actually get the Seahawks back in the game, but just fell short. And for Russell Wilson, the injury would keep him out for a month. And Geno Smith, not exactly the needle mover for the Seahawks offense that had Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. Speaking of DK Metcalf, he wasn't doing good at all throughout the season. And we'll talk about more about in a bit and on why. But nonetheless, Seahawks offense looked bad with Geno Smith under center. But again, not terribly bad, but is clearly bad against the Steelers and the Saints. 2 teams that were, just as bad, if not worse, than the Seahawks with Geno Smith under center. And, by the time Russell Wilson came back, you'd think that, he would get the team back on track and get them a late postseason berth, a wild card berth. But no, that didn't even happen. That didn't even happen this time around. The moment Russell Wilson returned in week 10, going up against Green Bay Packers in Lambeau, he looked like a completely different quarterback. He couldn't click with DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett. He looked scared to scramble out of the pocket. He was pretty much like a stoned quarterback. And he also rushed a lot of his throws and just to avoid the sack, or he would sometimes even eat the sack. He wouldn't even recognize the pressure coming to him. So in a way, that Russell Wilson's mentality somehow got effed in the A when he came back. And it would still get effed in the A when he came back. So this was to be a concerning trend going forward. And sometimes you'd think that did he get rushed back too early? Did the Seahawks rush him back too early, or did he rush himself back too early? So a lot of pressing matters for the Seahawks as the season continues to dwindle down. I mean, sure, they got a couple wins here and there. They got 5 more wins in 2021, but damn, the losses just kept piling up for Seattle. They only wound up, again, winning 5 more games, and they lost 8 more down the stretch. I mean, aside from Russell Wilson's injury, there were also a number of issues that broke down Seattle down the pipeline. There were also injuries at running back. Even with the signing of Adrian Peterson, he also got hurt. The secondary also suffered some injuries, like to Jamal Adams and Ryan Neal. But even with all the injuries, the secondary was already bad in itself. It only got worse as the season wore on. DK Metcalf, like I mentioned earlier, he played very poorly this season. He was the most targeted receiver, sure, but he wasn't catching many of those targets because he couldn't get separation from defenders, and he was also dropping a lot of passes. So positively though, on the run in the running game, I'd say Rashad Penny, like look finally after all these years, looked like a lead back in the final month of the season. And then you have your rookie corner Trey Brown. He looks like a solid piece in the secondary with some solid lockdown coverage. So maybe you can build around him in the secondary, get someone on the opposite side. And I guess the only consistent piece in the Seahawks overall was Tyler Lockett. But overall, very disappointing season for Seattle, who had expectations to return to the postseason. With Russell Wilson leading the charge, who was supposed to have like another like good season performance wise, but that injury in week 5 completely derailed things for Seattle. And I guess even had Russell Wilson played a full season, like I don't know, did he really think that how far do any of us think that Seattle would have went had Russell Wilson stayed healthy? Because let's face it, I think the biggest weakness aside from that and a hobbled Russell Wilson was the defense. The secondary was giving up like a shit ton of points. They were like nearly at the brink of breaking the record for allowing the most yards per game. Literally, they were literally right there. So Seattle face planted to a 7-10 record by season's end. They did get some nice wins towards the end of the season, especially in week 18 against the Arizona Cardinals. That would prevent them from winning the NFC West and I guess handing the Rams the title and giving them some motivation, I guess, to destroy the Cardinals in that wild card game. But for Seattle, it was just injuries and having one of the worst defenses in the league that led to their downfall. They do have some money to finally address the defense and maybe give Russell Wilson an offensive line, hopefully, to get him to stay. But yeah, that's probably the thing that Seattle has to address first. You gotta convince Russell Wilson to stay. I know that Pete Carroll's saying that Russell Wilson's gonna stay. There haven't been any talks of Russell Wilson wanting out of Seattle. Russell Wilson hasn't publicly demanded a trade yet at the time of this recording, but anything can happen in the NFL. For the Seattle Seahawks, this coming offseason, be it the free agency or the draft, they have to focus on the offensive line. They managed to address guards last year, but they'll seriously need to invest in the exterior because, when it comes to the edge pressure, Russell Wilson continues to get sacked by edge rushers. And even then, Russell Wilson continues to be one of the most sacked quarterbacks in the league. Now, a good quarter of that money needs to be invested in getting at least a healthy tackle on whether it's the left or the right. And, one of your free agents is left tackle Dwan Brown, who has been pretty solid for Russell Wilson, but the offensive line market is also looking pretty solid. So you might as well invest in the offensive line, make a good chunk of that $36 million go towards that offensive line. They also did address the secondary, even when their best corners were getting hurt. And prior to that, the Seahawks were getting cinnamon toast crunched for the last years on defense. Ever since the Legion of Boom broke up, they were getting burped on defense. They were getting burnt to a crisp. So Trey Brown does have some potential, but if he does have a good year too, maybe you can give him some help. You should give him some help. The corner market in free agency and the draft should help you out with that. If Russell Wilson does eventually declare a trade, or maybe not, but if he does, go to the Seahawks front office, say, hey, I'm officially putting in my request for a trade. Then they need to get the best possible package together for Russell Wilson's trade. I don't know what that is, what that'll look like, but in my opinion, it'll probably look like a couple first rounders, Russell Wilson, or they'll probably demand from other teams like first rounders, maybe a player or maybe another quarterback. But either way, get the best possible package for for compensation for Russell Wilson. So 2021 did derail a lot of the hopes the Seahawks had to getting back to the playoffs. But, 2022, if they get an offensive line, if they invest in a little bit in the defense, they can have a bounce back year in 2022. But that's if Russell Wilson wants to stay on board. If he commits to staying with Seattle in 2022 in this fall, then the front office needs to surround him with even more talent and better protection up front. And obviously, Russell Wilson has to stay healthy. And can't make any stupid decisions during games. But then again, if Russell Wilson demands a trade, he publicly requests it, all that pretty much changes. You're pretty much in rebuild city mode now. The Seahawks pretty much have to now build that best possible trade package. You have to now find a quarterback. You got to pretty much do all your team needs I mentioned and find that quarterback in this offseason. It's pretty much rebuild city in a hurry for Seattle, whether they like it or not.